Kakashi is an extremely powerful ninja. He even went on to become the 6th Hokage. Since the beginning of the series, we've seen just how strong he was. But the question remains, when did Kakashi reach Kage level? I always like to clarify that the definition of Kage level is quite broad. It's a term we use to refer to characters who are on a level equivalent to that of a village's Kage, who in theory is the strongest shinobi in that village, at least in theory. In practice, we know that the power level of a Kage varies greatly, and as I always say, simply being the strongest isn't enough to earn that title, since the appointment to that position involves many other factors. But in short, a ninja is considered Kage level when they've reached a degree of power comparable to that of a Kage.
各隠れ里の長のみが影の名を語ることを許されている。その火影、いわゆる五影は全世界各国何万の忍者の頂点に君臨する忍者たちだ。
It's no surprise that Kakashi had the qualifications to be appointed as the 6th Hokage, a position he achieved through his own merit. From a very young age, he stood out as a prodigy, graduating from the Ninja Academy at just 5 years old. At the age of 6, he reached the rank of Chunin, and by around 12 or 13, he was promoted to Jonin. In other words, while still very young, he had already reached the highest rank within the hierarchy that a shinobi can attain. So I ask you, was he not someone exceptional with the potential to become Hokage? Absolutely. After many years serving in the ANBU, Kakashi left the organization and took on the role of sensei for Chunin teams, later becoming the leader of Team 7. The first time we see him in action is during a mission in the Land of Waves, where he fights Zabuza Momochi. From the very beginning of the series, Kakashi displayed above-average abilities, intelligence, and battle strategy, traits that made it clear he was extremely powerful and far from an ordinary ninja. However, despite all his talent and displays of strength, Kakashi had not yet reached Kage level during the original Naruto series, and here's why. Several encounters he had reinforced this idea. For instance, during his meeting with Orochimaru, he faced an extremely dangerous opponent, and even though there wasn't a direct fight, it was clear he was facing a threat far beyond what he was used to dealing with. He even tried to intimidate the Sannin by saying that if Orochimaru attacked him, one of them would die. But shortly after, he contradicted himself, wondering what he had been thinking when he said that, a moment that clearly showed he was aware of his own limits. In the first part of the series, the power ceiling among ninjas was defined by the Sannin. They served as the benchmark for what it meant to be at an exceptionally high level, and their power was undoubtedly comparable to that of a Kage. It's precisely for this reason that Jiraiya was considered for the position, and Tsunade ultimately became Hokage. Within this stage of Naruto, even ninjas as strong as Kakashi still needed to evolve further to approach the level those legendary figures represented.
それに、君が私を殺すんだって。やってみれば、できればだけど。
Another example is his confrontation with Itachi, where he was quickly defeated by an opponent who was clearly at Kage level. In addition, his physical condition was another factor to consider, as he was out of practice and a bit out of shape. He even admits this himself when he struggles to climb a mountain, something he thought would be easy, but his body didn't respond as expected, making it clear that he wasn't in his best physical form. Therefore, based on these facts, we can conclude that during the original Naruto series, Kakashi truly wasn't at the level we might have expected. In the Shippuden phase, however, Kakashi trained and refined his skills, leaving behind that feeling of being rusty. As a result of this renewed dedication, he achieved mastery over the Mangekyo Sharingan, which he had awakened back in his teenage years, and through it gained access to the Kamui technique. However, his body still couldn't fully withstand the effects of that ability. After his battle with Deidara, for instance, he was so physically drained that he had to be hospitalized to recover. In other words, despite having gained an extremely powerful weapon, he still needed greater stamina, as well as maturity and experience in using this new power, something he only truly achieved during the Fourth Great Ninja War.
だが、あなたの体はその目に合う内派一族の体ではない。その通り、すぐバテちゃうからな。
So, if we had to define the exact point when Kakashi truly and undeniably solidified himself as being at Kage level, that moment would be during the war. But why only at that point? What's the reasoning behind it? Well, some fans argue that simply mastering the Mangekyo Sharingan and Kamui would already be enough to place him at Kage level, given the extraordinary power of distorting space-time. And that's a very valid and coherent point of view. After all, determining whether he reached that level before or during the war is subjective and largely a matter of opinion. However, it's important to highlight that during this arc, Kakashi demonstrated a remarkable improvement. He could use Kamui freely and repeatedly without suffering any noticeable drawbacks or side effects. This was in stark contrast to before, when even minimal use of the technique caused him severe physical strain. If we analyze his performance prior to the war, he certainly had strong moments. For example, during the Akatsuki suppression arc, he held his own in close combat against Haidan, and even against the real threat, Kakuzu. He showed his versatility multiple times, such as when he countered the Akatsuki member's lightning technique with his own Chidori, and when he blocked a fire attack using his water wall technique. Nevertheless, despite all these impressive displays of skill, as brilliant as they were, he was still one step below that enemy's level, having to focus much more on defense than on direct offense. It's also worth noting that Kakuzu himself was a Kage level opponent, and Kakashi, even with the help of Ino and Choji, who to be fair, didn't contribute much, was unable to defeat him.
次から次へと新しい世代が追い抜いていくのさ。
Here, the Leaf Jonin was pushed to his very limits and was only saved thanks to Naruto and Yamato arriving to help. These moments reinforced the idea that although Kakashi was extremely skilled, his physical stamina prevented him from sustaining long, high-level battles, something that would happen again later during his fight against Pain. In that battle, he also performed exceptionally well and showcased his strategic brilliance, analyzing the enemy's gravitational powers in real time and coming up with creative ways to neutralize attacks that would have been fatal for almost any other ninja. However, he simply didn't have the physical endurance to keep up in a fight of that magnitude. In other words, he was tactically on par with the challenge, but physically unable to maintain the pace. He was defeated not because of a lack of skill or intelligence in combat, but because his body simply couldn't withstand the intensity of a duel against such a powerful opponent. And when it comes to his use of Kamui, both to avoid being hit by that nail and to save Choji, employing that technique pushed him to his absolute limit, leaving him so exhausted that he ultimately ended up dying as a result. Therefore, when we analyze Kakashi's performance up to that point, the picture becomes quite clear. His stamina often prevented him from sustaining prolonged battles against top-tier opponents, forcing him to compensate for his physical limitations through versatility and improvisation. This contrast perfectly defines him at that stage of the story. He was a brilliant ninja who already possessed all the technical and mental qualities to be compared to a Kage, but he was still held back by physical factors. Because of that, he was unable to defeat certain enemies. Although he could still hold his own against opponents far stronger than himself, in my view, he was right at the threshold of Kage level, very close to it, and if someone were to argue that he had already reached that level, I wouldn't consider it unreasonable, since the difference compared to his performance during the war arc is minimal. But of course, it's clear that he did evolve. What truly supports his evolution in the final arc of the series is the fact that Kakashi was able to use Kamui far more efficiently and repeatedly, without becoming completely debilitated as he did early in Shippuden, achieving truly impressive feats as a result. For example, at one point he even attempted to teleport the Gedo Mazo, being stopped by Obito, and later successfully used Kamui to move the 10 tails, proving that he could now manipulate a Biju with that technique, something that previously would have seemed insane and physically impossible without immense consequences. If before Kamui had been a risky last resort technique, it had now become one of the most lethal and reliable weapons in Kakashi's arsenal. So, in Naruto Shippuden, we can clearly divide his journey into two distinct phases. Before before the war and during the war. Before, he was limited to using the Mangekyo Sharingan once or twice at most, always on the verge of physical collapse. But during the war, we saw a much more resilient Kakashi, someone capable of using Kamui multiple times without suffering the same debilitating consequences that had haunted him throughout the series. Some might interpret this evolution as a simple narrative choice, a plot convenience meant to keep him relevant on the battlefield. But personally, I don't see it that way. Kakashi had always been recognized as a true prodigy in chakra control, and as someone who managed his limited reserves with exceptional skill. Therefore, it's entirely reasonable to argue that this newfound efficiency during the war didn't come out of nowhere, but was the result of his growth as a shinobi and his remarkable ability to adapt. In other words, he surpassed himself, reinvented his fighting style, and found intelligent ways to channel his chakra to enhance his dojutsu, something that many might call a narrative miracle. To me, it's definitive proof of the genius Kakashi always was, and why he should never be underestimated. In Shippuden, he undeniably reached Kage level. The only question that remains is pinpointing exactly when that happened, whether before or during the war. And that brings us back to what I mentioned earlier. This is ultimately a subjective discussion, since both viewpoints have valid arguments. However, since the purpose of this video is to clarify exactly when he reached that level, in my view, the definitive milestone was during the Fourth Great Ninja War. It was in that context that Kakashi not only fully mastered Kamui, but also demonstrated the ability to sustain high-intensity battles in a way we had never seen from him before.
そもそも他国にまで轟かせた自分の有名を忘れちゃいないだろ。シャリンガンのかかしって名を。
One thing is certain, it's undeniable that the peak of Kakashi's power occurred when he obtained both of Obito's eyes and manifested a perfect Susanoo. However, that power was fleeting, temporary, the result of a unique and unrepeatable circumstance. And precisely because of that, after losing the dojutsu, he had to reinvent himself. It was then that he developed the Purple Lightning, an extremely powerful technique. That's exactly why I find it insulting when people claim that he never reached Kage level simply because he didn't possess a technique with massive visual impact or overwhelming destructive power. Kakashi carried on the will of fire, guiding and protecting Konoha until the right moment to pass the torch to Naruto, fully trusting his student to follow in his footsteps and safeguard the Leaf Village. After all, the greatest strength of a master lies in inspiring his students to become the best versions of themselves. Well, we've reached the end of the video. If you liked it, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also leave a comment to help with engagement. Cheers, and see you next time.